Good afternoon. As Provost, it's my pleasure to welcome you on the university's behalf. And in just a few minutes, Bill Burke-White, inaugural director of Perry Worldhouse, will introduce our panelists. But before we begin this program, I want to thank all of you for being here and for your support of Penn's global initiatives. I know that you join me in appreciating what a tremendous architectural asset this new facility brings to Penn's campus. And that said, its foundation, while solid, is very much more than concrete. Underpinning the creation of Perry Worldhouse is an intellectual and an educational philosophy that a deep understanding of global affairs requires academic research, public policy experience, and diplomatic expertise. Taken alone, each is very important. But without the intellectual integration of these three key components, we cannot make proper sense of the world. Penn is a leader in multidisciplinary teaching and research, so this philosophy is really nothing new to us. And as you probably know, Benjamin Franklin himself was a businessman, a scholar, a scientist, and America's first ambassador. He enjoyed wine, so naturally he was ambassador to France. Today, his university, this University of Pennsylvania, is the ideal home for Perry Worldhouse. We are truly an international campus. And it's been said that we rival the United Nations in country count. That's perhaps an exaggeration. But our first-year students alone come from over 60 countries, and 5,000 Penn students are from outside the United States. There is no more opportune time for the work that will be done here. From the Brexit vote to the current US presidential election, and with the rising tide of global migration, we are sailing in uncharted waters. This evening and going forward, Perry Worldhouse offers the opportunity to work together and think together, to analyze world events and to address global challenges. Before I begin, I want to take just a moment to thank Director Bill Burke-White, Vice Provost Zeke Emanuel, together for their leadership, their creativity, and their vision in making this physical space the intellectual endeavor that will, I think, bring to Penn for years and years to come exactly what I've just described. So thank you, Bill. And finally, a quick plug for our program tomorrow. When we have our official dedication, Navi Pillay, the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, will speak at 10 a.m. And at 2 o'clock, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates will give the Perry Worldhouse inaugural keynote address. Both are free and open to the public, but registration is required. It's quick and relatively painless, just like international diplomacy. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Bill Burke-White.
So thank you, Vince. It's a pleasure to see so many friends of Perry Worldhouse and familiar faces with us tonight. With no further ado, I would like to invite our panel to join me on the stage, and I'll introduce them briefly, and we'll get right going. So please come with. Just go straight as you're... So I want to very briefly introduce our panel because all of their full bios are provided in the handout. But to my immediate left is Ambassador Mir Puri from Singapore. He has served as Singapore's representative in Washington since July 2012. He's also served as the ambassador to Indonesia, the High Commissioner to Malaysia, and the High Commissioner to Australia. I will note that he served as the Director of Policy Planning in the Singaporean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an office I served in under Secretary Clinton, and delighted to do that long-term thinking that we do in that office. To his left is Caroline Vicini, the Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union. Ambassador Vicini has served in that post since September 2015, but holds the rank of ambassador in the Foreign Service of Sweden, her home country, and has also served on behalf of Sweden here in Washington. To her left is Ambassador Hussein Haqqani, a Pakistani scholar and public figure who served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2011, managing a challenging partnership during a critical phase in the global war on terror. He is currently a senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. To his left is Ambassador Boris Rouge, the Deputy Chief, Ruge, sorry, I keep doing that and putting the French pronunciation in. Forgive me, Ambassador Ruge. He is the Deputy Chief of Mission of Germany and has just joined us here in Washington in August 2016, so welcome to the United States. Prior to that, he served as Germany's ambassador in Saudi Arabia and its envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And a man who needs no introduction here at Penn, Dean Jeffrey Garrett, the Dean of the Wharton School, a global citizen who has served as the Dean of the Business School, both at the University of Sydney and the University of New South Wales, a political economist who's written widely on the politics of the global economy and the diffusion of markets and democracy. We're delighted to have Jeff join us as our discussant today. So I want to kick things off with the fact that the United Nations General Assembly is meeting today in New York. And one of the topics that the UN is focused on is around sustainable development and the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals to end poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and tackle climate change proclaimed by the United Nations last year. I'm wondering whether, in each of your opinions, the Sustainable Development Goals have impacted your country's approach to global economic development and how you're framing your development agendas and your role in the global economy in light of those goals. And Ambassador Mir Puri, I'm going to start with you since you're right to my left and you're the senior ambassador on the panel today.
And also because I just got off the train from New York.
Thank you for coming down.
Attending the UN General Assembly at the start today. And it's a chaotic city. But the whole world assembles over there because the agenda of the UN has become very important and critical. You know, you can call it a talk shop in some ways. Those of us who engage in bilateral diplomacy look at multilateral diplomacy quite differently. But year by year, the UN has been adding on to its agenda. And this year, climate change is a very substantial part of it, the sustainable goals. It's for Singapore, you know, we've had a very dramatic development of our country. We're 51 years independent, and we essentially moved from a third world country to a first world country. In fact, there's a book title, From Third World to First. A very dramatic transformation of a country without any resources. We have to import all our energy. We have to import all our food. We have to import even most of our water. But the whole focus has been on leadership and education. And that's really the way that we have dealt with the hand that we were given when we did become independent and worked around the region and partnered around the world. Today, Singapore hosts more US investments than any other country in the Asia Pacific because we've created an economic environment that invites foreign investors to come in, intellectual property protection. Annually, in all the lists, you'll see Singapore is one of the best places to do business. And that's really the model that we use in our development, of getting others to learn from us. We're fairly careful to say that you cannot copy Singapore. We have no agriculture, we have no farmers to worry about. We just have to focus on trade. And trade is 4 times our GDP. Trade creates half our jobs. That's a very essential part of it. Where we have done development, we've invited people to come and learn from us. So Singapore does not give financial assistance to anyone. what we do is we run courses for people to come and learn in Singapore. How do you run a port? How do you run an airport? And more than 100,000 people have been trained in Singapore from various countries. And that's where we feel it is a more useful way for us to do our development agenda, even while fitting into what the UN wants to achieve. And at the same time, raising the standards for our population. Education is a very critical part of it, given that's the only resource we have, working with universities around the world, sending our students out around the world, and really learning from around the world to see what is best for them. So that's really how the model works. We've come to a critical point. After 50 years, you look back and you can pat yourself on the back for your success, but you look ahead and you worry about what's going to come next. Because technology is changing dramatically, the environment is changing dramatically, climate change, raising the waters would have very severe consequences in Singapore. These are all issues we have to look ahead for. And we're thinking, what can we do with Singapore for that future? And that's one issue that we are looking at for what comes next.
Thank you. Ambassador Vicini.
Thank you. And first of all, congratulations to this wonderful new building and to this wonderful new institution that I think has taken completely the right approach to the problems we're facing today, looking at them at a horizontal way and trying to join forces from many disciplines. And really good luck with your work here. And I'm honored to be here today. I just wanted to say before I start a few words on the EU, because I always feel that it's good to remember certain things about the EU when I start to talk. And is that the EU, first of all, is composed of 28 independent sovereign nations. That's often forgotten. You know, it's 28 nations that have chosen to work together in a partnership that is pretty unique in the world. It's also a continuously moving target. It's not like the United States that has a constitution that is several hundred years old. EU's last constitution, the Lisbon Treaty, dates to 2009. So it has been renewed many times. It's also an entity that has grown with time. You know, it started out with 6 countries in the 50s, and now we are 28. And just to mention the elephant in the room, so we get rid of that one as well. Yes, Brexit, it's a unique thing. Nobody has ever left the EU before. Remarkably enough, we had actually a paragraph in the Lisbon Treaty that deals with this, paragraph 50 or Article 50. But rest assured that the 27 remaining will continue to work together. And I do not see that the Union is falling apart, notwithstanding the challenges we have in front of us. The Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, the EU has been in the forefront in working on that agenda. After the Millennium Goals, when it was said that we need some new targets, because the Millennium Goals was actually a very successful way of working with the development issues, the EU has been very engaged in developing those goals, as being the world's largest provider of foreign aid and development funds. We have internalized, I would say, also the Agenda 2030 already almost from the beginning. Our trade agenda, for example, and does not have to change because we had already sort of taken on board the Millennium Goals when it was adjusted last time. And now we have the opportunity to work with the 2030 agenda, both internally, because of course it's not an agenda only for the developing world, but it's an agenda for all countries. And as the EU has a very wide spectrum of issues that we are working on, it touches on many of these 17 or 19 goals, 17? 17. 17 goals. So it's already internalized in our own working programs that we have taken on. But of course, they will have a great importance also for what we do when we continue to develop our development aid and our trade agenda.
Ambassador Haqqani.
So let me just begin by saying that I probably represent 3 very different phenomena on this panel. I represent a developing country rather than developed countries. I represent a Muslim majority country with all the attendant issues that we have in the greater Muslim world right now. And I represent a South Asian country and a country about which, by and large, people have a realization that it is not one of those countries that is moving well in the direction of development. Why did I mention all these factors? Because all development discussion actually is aimed at making lives better for the developing countries, but is often driven by the developed countries. And so the developing countries often have this perspective, and I'm sure that if my Indian counterpart was here, he would be saying the same thing, despite the fact that India and Pakistan don't normally get along on a lot of things, including on the, on the cricket field. They would agree that basically the way, so the developed world sometimes fails to recognize that while they were in their various stages of development, they had certain rules that they played by, and after they have become developed, they think that these guys shouldn't really have those benefits. Say, for example, the West was very protectionist. Many countries benefited from in terms of the environment, doing things that they shouldn't have done. And so there's a feeling that, now it's our turn. I don't agree with it, but I'm just sharing the feeling. And that actually then comes in the way of our being able to agree with the so-called goals that are collectively set. That's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that all three hats that I said I was wearing tonight, each one of them also represents significant political problems. And in the end, development is not a technical issue. It's a political issue. And that is something that sometimes, especially young people, so when I was teaching as a professor in this country, there would be all these young people who would come and say to me, so when I said, what about your career choice? And they'd say, we want to become development professionals. And I used to feel like telling them, well, yeah, it's not like development is a mechanical, technical function that you will perform. You will have to understand a lot of things that are connected to the politics of it. Just to illustrate. So Pakistan is the world's 6th largest country by population. But it is only the 42nd largest country by GDP. And if you use the PPP basis for GDP, then it's the 26th. But there's another complicating factor, and people like me in Pakistan are raise this a lot more than those who actually wield power, and that is that Pakistan is has the world's 6th largest military and the 7th largest nuclear arsenal. So is there really a connection between the fact that we actually do spend a lot more on the military? Are we really not able to provide butter because we've made the guns and butter choice wrong? Then that plays into the politics of other countries that may actually need us in strategic and other competition. So I think that I would like to broaden the discussion beyond just the 17 goals, but also bring us to discussing why certain countries, even when they acknowledge those goals, are unable to meet them. And a lot of that has to do with conflict. It has to do with it has to do with the internal politics, and then it has sometimes to do with culture. And we will talk about all of that as we move along.
Ambassador Ruge.
I'd like to join my colleagues in congratulating you on this institution and this beautiful building. It's an honor to be here and to represent Germany on this day. As you pointed out, I'm a recent arrival, but I know that a little less than a year ago, our federal president, Joachim Gauck, came to this university, and I think to
Perry World House.
To Perry. I don't know where it was at the time.
We didn't
here,
exist, but
he gave a speech on the issue of freedom, and there's few people, I think, who are better placed to give such a speech than him, coming out of the civil rights movement in East Germany. And I think that's always an important discussion to be had. And I think if we look at the relationship between Europe, specifically the EU, and the United States of America, that is something that we would like to think of as an area of freedom, both in political terms and economic terms. And that's something that we'll perhaps discuss a little later on. I'm not much of an expert on SDGs. I would say that many people in Germany intuitively feel that this is very important. Many people in Germany for a long time, for decades at this point, have been very interested in the environment. Climate change was an issue that was identified very early in Germany as a critical issue. And I would agree with my esteemed colleague that I think there's a discussion to be had about distributing the costs of development and how we deal with that today. But I think we are also collectively part of a learning process. And once we've identified an issue, as in the case of climate change, we have a collective responsibility as one world, if you like, to look at that and to see how we can cope in the interest of all. Because the costs of climate change, I'm assuming, will be borne disproportionately by people in less developed countries. And therefore, it is not so much, I think, a luxury issue, and it is not something that is primarily our interest. I think it's truly a global interest, and that's how we should look at it.
Jeff, I want to let you jump in here. We've heard a couple of different models of where the development agenda is headed, and I wanted to get your thoughts on where you see the global development agenda going in response to the different views.
So I was sitting here listening to these wonderful sets of remarks, and I was remembering I was on a panel like this in New York a few months ago, and I just didn't come up with the right line. I was sitting in exactly the same place, and it was, now I know how John Kasich felt. And you remember Kasich was always at the end in the debates? Anyway, that's for people who are following Republican debates. Now I have to apologize to the people over here because I'm hiding my light behind the Perspex monitor. Sorry for that. As our distinguished guests were speaking, I really was having two broad thoughts. First thought is that if you really look at the last 30 years of economic history in the world, reduction in poverty has been arguably the single most important thing that's happened in the world. And I think if you're dispassionate about that, it actually is because of globalization rather than multilateral development organizations. So put differently, trade and investment have really helped reduce poverty around the world. That's observation one. Observation two, I think we're in a really interesting pivot moment right now, which is that an enthusiasm, my read, is that enthusiasm for the globalization agenda, more trade, more investment, et cetera, is actually, if anything, increasing in developing countries, but clearly decreasing in the Western world, which is so ironic because it means we've flipped the Washington consensus from 25 years ago. So those were my two opening observations. I don't know whether either is controversial.
So I want to jump into what is perhaps one of the most controversial places in the development agenda at the moment, and that's trade. Trade has been a driver of some of that eradication of poverty you mentioned, Jeff. It's also an issue that now is politically charged around the world. So Ambassador Mirpuri, I want to start with you. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. Singapore has been a key component of that. It may be the United States to blame for it not moving forward at the moment. Where's the TPP headed, and where does Singapore see its role in the global trade architecture?
I'm more optimistic. But first, on Jeff, your point on poverty eradication, I think you have to give a lot of credit to China for that. I think China is very little understood for what they have done in order to move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into a better life.
Absolutely. But China was not part of the WTO when most of the poverty reduction happened in China. So I think there is a view that wants to say it was a lot about institutional architecture, whereas if you look at a lot of the cases, it happened without the institutional architecture. It was really private sector led.
Well, China joined the WTO about 25 years ago, and they used that to make certain adjustments that now, in fact, people are dealing with. But coming back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Singapore was actually the founder of the TPP. Singapore did a bilateral free trade agreement with the US about 11 years ago. That was the first free trade agreement the US did with any Asian country. We set that up as a gold standard. And the TPP was meant to build on that. 4 small countries, Singapore, Brunei, who you probably can't even put place on a map, Chile and New Zealand came together to form what was called the P4. And the Americans then came in and transformed it into the TPP, and subsequently 7 other countries came in. Australia, Vietnam, socialist economy, Malaysia, that couldn't complete their bilateral free trade agreement with the United States, Peru, Canada and Mexico, your NAFTA partners, and very importantly, Japan, that does not have a free trade agreement with the US. And we wanted to build an agreement that raised high standards. And the US administration saw that as very important. It's got stuck now in the political headwinds of the election campaign. But I think that all the countries are still very optimistic that it can be done because we all followed a model that served the United States. The TPP, if you look at it, brings these countries up to US standards. It doesn't bring US standards down. And the moment we concluded the agreement early this year, countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines all said we want to be part of this. Even though it may be a while before they can get into this, this becomes that multilateral framework for the Asia Pacific. And the important part of this multilateral framework is that the US is the pivotal anchor in it. So a failure of the ability to get TPP through Congress would be a loss of that pivotal anchor of the United States because there are other trade arrangements happening in the region. There's something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that involves China, India, 16 other countries. A lower standard, but that's going ahead. China's rolled out something called the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, One Belt, One Road. In ASEAN, we have come together as ASEAN Economic Community. In none of this does the US play a part, only in the TPP. It's got a very strong strategic element around it. And that's we think, and the administration now is trying very hard to get it through Congress. Members of Congress are mixed. I think once we get the mechanics right, hopefully we should be able to get it through. But I'm optimistic. My Prime Minister was in Washington, D.C. last month, made a very strong pitch for the strategic arguments of TPP. And this was it's an agreement that will move the world, move the Asia-Pacific forward. It's a very important part of the pivot to Asia that the Obama administration has spent the past 8 years doing, and it will build on the future for the next administration.
Could I just make one comment on this? I think for everybody who's following the American political debate, these trade agreements can sound really, really arcane and pretty boring and all that stuff. And TPP, I think if you asked even pretty informed citizens, they couldn't tell you what it stood for. The interesting thing in the political debate right now is that the trade with China and TPP are brought together as the same thing, which is profoundly ironic because China is not in the TPP. And in fact, one could argue that the TPP is designed to entrench American rules of trade in Asia so that they're not Chinese rules. It just shows you how weird our politics has become at the moment, that TPP and China become exactly the same thing in politics.
Well, we hope to have China join one day as well.
It's ignorance, but you can see how it works. It's fear of this thing, and since trade is bad and China is bad, of course they come together.
It gets conflated together.
So I want to pick up on the question about China's development and the role of the WTO in that by posing a question to you, Ambassador Haqqani, which is from the perspective of a developing country, not part of the TPP. Should we be concerned that the architecture of global trade is becoming either more regional or more country groupings that are in a more similar state of economic development and leaving other parts of the world behind? Where does Pakistan see the trade architecture heading?
So before I tell you what Pakistan thinks, let me just say that if we look at the other regions, every region has benefited from a regional architecture. ASEAN, for example, 25% of trade of all ASEAN nations is among themselves. NAFTA, 50% of all trade is between the 3 countries of NAFTA. South Asia, on the other hand, is one of the least integrated regions in the world. Only 5% of the trade of the 8 countries that are members of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation takes place within the region. And that is mainly because of this huge problem between India and Pakistan. So Pakistan doesn't allow many of the things that everybody else agrees on. And in that sense, even though I have represented Pakistan, I'm one of those who within Pakistan would argue we need to stop doing that because we will benefit. But that brings me to 2 points that were made earlier. I agree that globalization rather than architecture actually is more responsible for limiting poverty. So, for example, India has succeeded in taking at least 1/3 of the people that were in poverty in India 10 years ago out of poverty. So it's following the same path as China, again, through trade and investment. Whereas Pakistan is not succeeding because Pakistan is trying to buck the trend of globalization. And that is really the issue in developing countries. And China's role, for example, varies. So in East Asia, it has been by and large benign, which is why I can understand my Singaporean friend being sympathetic to China and wanting to praise it. In our part of the world, China actually sometimes helps entrench conflicts for political advantage. China's biggest Asian rival is going to be India. So what does China do? China props up this horrible government in Myanmar for years. Thank God that that's gone, but which shuts Myanmar down and also stops interconnectivity between India and East Asia, which needs to go through Myanmar. And then it does the same in Pakistan, my country, where the military, which has taken part directly in 4 military coups in 70 years, is the most powerful institution. And now China is holding out the promise of investing $46 billion in Pakistan under the One Belt, One Road scheme, but only on the assumption that Pakistan will exclude India from it. So Pakistan will become a dumping ground for China's cheap goods. It will become the road for China to have access to the Persian Gulf, but it will not benefit the people of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, who would benefit if there were road and trade links, which are the historic trade links that exist with India. And I think that the regional arrangements need to be encouraged, but then they should also not be allowed to be manipulated politically as they are. But then if somebody does that, you can't really stop them, is the other side to it. And one last point, I agree with you on climate change. I think that the developing world's concern, I think, is not so much that we want to have the right to pollute because you polluted for so long before. It's about the cost. We have to figure out a way of sharing the burden, because those who have achieved a certain level of development by contributing to climate change in a negative way have to basically pay for cleaning it up a little more than those who have not brought the world to where it is today. And I think that is, again, going to be a major political issue. So globalization, for example, may have benefited all the developed countries, but guess what? There's a backlash there, because now the benefits of that globalization might go to other countries. And so people then start saying, no. We benefited, the system benefited us, now let's keep it here and not let the system benefit others. And the politics of it is going to be far more complex, both here, and then there's going to be I don't know if anybody has even started thinking what the consequences are going to be of the extremes that we are seeing in developed countries in politics, what the consequences of those are going to be once they actually do materialize. Right now, they're just like on television, but once they are in the White House, can you imagine what the reaction is going to be in a country like mine, or in a country like Afghanistan, or a country like India? It will also drive our politics totally in a very different direction. And so, will there be more people like ISIS taking over more countries? Absolutely. People who will say, yeah, we are also against globalization. You don't want globalization that benefits us economically. We don't want globalization that lets your culture take over our culture.
So I want to turn to this backlash, but bring in one more element before we do. We spend a lot of time talking about trade with China or in the Asia Pacific, but the most dense trade relationship in the world is that between the United States and Europe. Yet the TTIP is stagnating, the potential US-EU trade agreement, partly because of politics within the EU, partly with the United States. And I want to turn to our two European representatives to ask, what is the future of the TTIP, and where does Europe see the global trade architecture? Ambassador Vicini, I'll start with you since you're closest to me.
Yeah, first also, it's important to point out that in the EU, it's the Commission that has deal with the trade negotiations for all the 28 member states. So that's why the UK will not be able to start to negotiate trade agreements with other countries until it has actually exited the EU. And first of all, I want to say we are fully supporting the TPP. We hope and we speak well about it as soon as we can, because we hope it will go through Congress. It's very important for TTIP that TPP goes through Congress, because if that doesn't happen, we will see even further problems. Then we see on second hand, we see the development of this anti-trade agenda, both here and in Europe, and I think Boris can speak more to that, because it's as very worrying. We believe that trade is good for economic development. We have a large program, a huge program actually, called Aid for Trade, which helps countries, mostly the least developed countries, to develop their own trade capacities, to be able to trade better. And we believe in regionalization. It's good for countries to trade, and it's good to start in your own neighborhood, because that is often an easier thing than to start to trade with Europe, even if Europe is open for trade from the least developed countries without any tariffs and quotas. But for TTIP, TTIP is a very advanced agreement, or the idea is to make a very advanced agreement, which is not only an agreement regulating what we have today, but also sort of forward-looking, trying to prevent that in regulation, for example, we go separate roads, that try to see that standards, for example, are developing equally in the United States and in Europe. It's about ridiculous that our cars, for example, that we drive in Europe and the United States are equally safe, but there are certain very small things that makes it that you have to develop a different model in Europe than in the United States for the US market, and you have to test it twice because the tests are different. And such things, and there are many, many others, is something that we are trying to overcome in TTIP. The negotiations are, as a result of this ambition, very demanding. And usually to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, it's something that takes a very, very long time. It can take 10 years. Here we have been dealing with this for 3.5 years, which is a very short time. A lot has been done, but a lot remains. And for the EU, it's important. We have certain demands, certain requirements on this agreement that we need to have fulfilled. Otherwise, we can say beforehand that it will not be ratified, nor in the European Parliament, nor in the 28 national parliaments. And this is something that we are trying to tell the US administration, that has the high ambition to conclude this agreement before the end of President Obama's term. So it could happen, but it would require, I think, from
Going to be hard the next 3 months.
24/7 work, and I'm not sure that's going to happen. But certainly there is a round in New York now in the beginning of October. I can say that Ambassador Froman, the USTR, and Cecilia Malmström, who is the Commissioner for Trade, are in contact, if not daily, each week. It's really, really intense. And the ambition is there, but technically might be a bit difficult.
Ambassador Ruge, Germany is the largest economy in Europe, though the competence on trade issues has shifted to Brussels. I'm wondering how you see Germany advancing the trade agenda and whether you agree with Ambassador Vicini about the prospects being perhaps more rosy than I might have painted them.
Now, Germany is, as everyone knows, a big exporting country and a beneficiary of international trade. And the government view is, despite some critical remarks that have been made recently, very much in favor of TTIP and moving ahead of that. Actually, as we speak, there's a lot of work that is being done on the Canada-EU trade agreement, CETA. And we're working very hard to finalize that. And we're hoping that a good part of that can be put into force in early 2017. That's very important, I think, because if that happens, I think it does open the way, in a sense, for TTIP. At the same time, while we, I think it's a statement that you could make about Germany or about the United States of America, our economies have profited from international trade, and yet there's a skepticism in both places. Not necessarily in most of Europe. I think in 24 out of 28 EU countries, you have a majority in the polls in favor of TTIP. But Germany is one of the countries where in the polls, people are skeptical and they're afraid. And why is that? I think it deserves some examination. Because at the end of the day, the benefits of international trade are not necessarily distributed equally. So I think that needs to be looked at. To a large extent, I think that is homework for national governments to figure out how they can organize their economies, their societies in such a way as to take everyone along. Because if you leave people behind, then inevitably they will take a rather critical view of these kinds of measures because they feel they're losing control, they're being left behind. You could I think, make an argument that the whole Brexit discussion and the outcome of Brexit was a little bit about that as well. There's a parallel. So I think we should be careful. We should be mindful of the population as a whole and those who risk being left behind. And if we do that, I think we can be optimistic about moving ahead with a trade agenda. But it's certainly a big issue in an election campaign in the United States of America. TTIP not so much, but TPP very much so. I imagine that in the national elections in Germany and France next year, TTIP will be an issue. It has to be handled. But if our political parties can reach out to people and can respond to some of the fears, I'm optimistic that we'll be able to move ahead with this trade agenda, and that something like TTIP can also be a catalyst for broader trade agreements. I don't necessarily think that this kind of arrangement goes against a broader approach to free trade.
Ambassador Haqqani?
Just a quick point, and that is that political systems like China's, or for that matter, Singapore's until not long ago, allow a kind of decision-making, sort of centralized decision-making about economic issues that is not easy in democracies. And so we also have to figure out, so it's really a very high, it's a high-wire balancing act to make the right decisions on development, on trade, and then at the same time manage to get support. Now, Europe is really, it really requires a lot of skill. 28 sort of national parliaments, different kinds of economies, so therefore different sets of voters, and anything can happen. And now we are seeing a similar process here. So I would just say that creating global architectures for trade and institutional goals as well as institutional frameworks for development is actually easier than negotiating this complex high-wire political act that involves many, many countries. And so having more democracies, which is a good thing in a different way in terms of participation, in terms of protection of people's individual rights, etc. A side effect of it is that based on wrong information or a total ignorance of facts can result in decisions by the general public about trade and development issues which do not necessarily advance those goals.
Jeff, I want to turn to you. We've heard a fairly optimistic picture about several trade agreements. Sometimes when I read the national press or talk to friends in Washington, it's not that optimistic. What do you think? Is there a prospect that any of these are going to move forward, or is the backlash that we've heard about in several of these comments behind the scenes enough that we're going to find the trade agenda stalled?
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, look, let me say two things very briefly. First one is that it was a remarkable thing to me when Hillary Clinton, when pressed, had to say she didn't support the Trans-Pacific Partnership since she was the Secretary of State when it was negotiated. That was a remarkable thing. Second, we've had this bizarre flip in American politics where Hillary Clinton now looks to me like the last vestige of Rockefeller Republicans, a sort of robust American engagement in the world and pro-globalization, where Donald Trump looks like a populist Democrat. How's all that been possible? I think the thing that we haven't talked about yet is the impact of slow growth on all of this public opinion. So we knew in the 1990s, because both the political science and the economics were showing it, we always knew that trade had distributive consequences. Yes, it was good in aggregate, but there were distributive consequences, and we knew there were people who weren't going to do well. What's different today is how many people aren't doing well. About the scariest thing that I've read this year is a McKinsey Global Institute report which estimates that 75% of people in the advanced industrial democracies have suffered declining real incomes in the past decade. If you want to ask me why are a lot of these views that have been there for a long time much more politically salient than they've ever been before, it's that reason. And of course, that doesn't give you much optimism, because we know, or rather the go-to sources for growth in the first world tend to be narrowing, not broadening. They're globalization and technology. So if we want to drive up growth, we risk making growth even less inclusive at a time when we have to make growth more inclusive. So I think it's pretty hard to have one of these jobs right now, because you've got to, not only have you got to hold the course, you've got to explain to people why it's in their interests. And that is an enormous political challenge, I think.
So, yeah, please.
No, I think one thing that is missing in the debate here is the fact that you have to help people adjust. That assistance that needs to come in, because you can promise someone that their children or grandchildren will have a better life with a global trade agreement, but they're the ones feeling the consequences now. They, their neighbor, relative, the adjustment hasn't been able to take place.
Sweden was the one country that wasn't suffering in big parts of the electorate declining real incomes. Why? Because the Swedes, who've been free traders for a very long time, have believed in something that they call active labor market policies, which really means not resisting change, but allowing people to benefit from change. Yeah. So rather than a traditional welfare state response, it's empowering people to do better in the market. And the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, have done that better than everybody in the world. But of course, if you're in the US and you say, let's do it the way Sweden does, that tends not to work so well politically.
May I just
yes,
comment
please,
on that?
yes,
Because
absolutely.
I think often, you think that if you could engineer a trade agreement or free trade agreement in a certain way, the consequences wouldn't be that dire, and everybody could gain from it. I don't really think that is the case. I mean, I used to call myself free trade Taliban, because we are really free traders all the way out. We encourage imports, among other things, which also the EU does actually with its aid for trade project. But what it has to be accompanied with other social measures. And I think one thing that is really important today, and I know we share between the EU and the United States the same, at least with this administration, the same concern, that the labor force has to be continuously developed. You cannot and I think that's even more important for those who are young students here today. Probably you will not, the thing you exit this university with, those skills will not be the skills that are needed when you are 5 years before retirement. I think and their society has to play a role. I mean, the individual cannot, on its own expense, and particularly if you are in a low-skilled job, take on that. The challenge is maybe that with technology, not everyone are really able to achieve those level of education. But on the other hand, there's a service sector that is also broadening out, and that can maybe pick up some of that slack. But I do agree. You cannot resist. We can't go back to the 50s where all the women are in the kitchen and all the men are going off and doing their job at the sort of in the industry and so on. We have to live with the development, and we have to try to find the best accompanying measures, which is for
We are
our
all
government.
conditionally optimistic. We are not pessimistic, but we are not completely optimistic either. So you have to understand that. And I think one of the conditions everybody seems to be suggesting is that how you actually convince people and bring them round to understanding the issues is an important part of the whole debate.
Yeah, the domestic politics. This Ambassador Ruge, you wanted to come in.
Just to respond to Jeff's observation, two remarks. One, in 24 out of 28 EU countries, you have majorities in the polls in favor of TTIP, for example. That suggests to me that there's a cause for optimism. Now, the fact that in my country there's a majority against TTIP is something that we have to work on. But to that, I would say anyone bearing political responsibility, anyone in government, will also have to explain to voters whether they'll be better off with a different policy that goes against free trade, whether that will create more prosperity, and whether that will benefit the people who've been suffering. And I'm assuming the answer to that is no, it won't. Closing up will not create. So there's an issue of distribution inside economies and societies. There's an issue of global distribution, if you like, and competition. But closing up is not going to make people in Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Portugal better off at the end of the day.
I want to ask Ambassador Haqqani a question, which is, one piece of this puzzle that we haven't talked about tonight is the fact that Pakistan is a predominantly Muslim state. We had a fascinating discussion earlier today about the role of religion in global politics. And I'm wondering, particularly as you're thinking about the trade and development agenda, the domestic politics of that, how does representing a predominantly Muslim state shape that conversation back at home or the articulation of these issues at home?
That reminds me of a teenage joke, how do porcupines make love? And the answer is carefully. And that's exactly how representing Pakistan ends up being. The political minefields there are several times wider, bigger, more explosive than they are in other countries. You have 2/3 of the people living on below $2 a day per household, 1/3 below the poverty line, which is $1 a day per household. Then you have this religious factor. But again, as far as the domestic politics is concerned, it all depends upon people who are driving the agenda. And this is something that I must share, especially with the younger members of the audience. It's always very easy to craft a political argument to appeal to a small segment and then call it your base. And we are paying a very heavy price for that in Pakistan. Our founders, they thought that, breaking away from India and creating a Muslim majority country, they will be able to argue that, you will have your own majority. But then what the consequence of it was that once the minorities were driven out of the country, there were people who started saying, okay, now let's make this into an Islamic state. Then what is an Islamic state? No 6 Muslims can agree on what is an Islamic state. So you're reminded of that Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian. And so I sometimes want to make a movie like that about the Islamic world, and probably in collaboration with my friend Majid Nawaz. So you will have, I am from the Liberation Front for Islam, and I'm from the Islamic Liberation Front, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda now disagree. And Pakistan is right in the middle of it. We actually now have areas where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are contending for recruitment on the basis of who will serve Islam better. And that is definitely not a recipe for development, and it's certainly not a recipe for trade. And we have suffered from another thing. Look, remember, we shouldn't forget, there's a famous saying that when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. When the Soviets were being driven out of Afghanistan, the whole world thought it was a great idea to give money and support to these crazies who came to our country and who basically wanted to create a more Islamic Afghanistan and throw the Soviets out. Well, the Soviets went away, But those crazies have multiplied and have had offspring. And we have a very young population. Pakistan's median age is 21.5, which means half of our 200 million people are below the age of 21.5. And that is a very young population, very impressionable. You can bring them around to loving Justin Bieber, you can bring them around to loving Osama bin Laden, and unfortunately the latter is succeeding.
Jeff.
I just wanted to jump in on this point because I think it's incredibly important. So Pakistan is a massive and strategically important country. But if you think about something where the West maybe has more responsibility or at least more mechanisms at its disposal, it would be two other large Muslim-majority democracies, Turkey and Indonesia. And, in both cases, I think there's understandable reticence from the West to become too tightly entwined with those countries. Turkey has been in this long EU queue now for, almost really for 20 years, if you take the Turkish side. And Indonesia, a very complex country, Indonesia has remained pretty non-aligned and I think less connected with the West than it would want to. Absolutely, but I think the broader geopolitical point would be that Immanuel Kant was probably right, however long ago that was, 300 years ago, that economic engagement is a really good way to increase political integration, political understanding, and peace as well as prosperity. We tend to think about this as a prosperity agenda, but it has a big peace dimension as well. And the difficulty that the West has embracing Muslim-majority countries, even Muslim-majority democracies that are relatively well advanced, just tells you how challenging this environment is. And when I was in Berlin, I used to live in Kreuzberg. I thought Kreuzberg was just the coolest place going, with all the Turkish Gastarbeiter in Turkey. But those people, or in the Netherlands, they don't have citizen rights. They haven't had citizen rights, and Turkish integration has been a real challenge for Europe, obviously.
Mr. Ruge? I can react to that very briefly. I think it's true that we've had a long, ongoing negotiation with Turkey about accession, but I don't feel that the EU has not been forward enough about this. There's a big debate going on in various countries in the EU, including in Germany, about whether Turkey can and should be a member of the EU. But I would suggest this. The EU is quite a challenging club to be a part of. It requires giving up a significant element of sovereignty. And if you look at Turkey today, but even if you looked at Turkey a few years ago, you could ask the question legitimately whether Turkish society and the Turkish elite is ready to become part of such a club that requires surrendering a significant part of your sovereignty and accepting decisions made in institutions that you cannot dominate. And I think, if you look at Turkey today, I think that's really a question that you can't answer, which doesn't mean, certainly, that we should reject Turkey and that we should close the door, and it's something we're not doing. But I would challenge the notion that we have not been welcoming enough.
I agree with you 100%. The worrying thing for me would be, if we turned the clock back, maybe Turkey would have been a better EU member 15 years ago than today, and that would be a tragic thing if that's the way it plays out.
The Muslim world does have its own psychosis to deal with. I mean, look, the heart of the Muslim world is the Middle East. And the reason why we are where we are is because we border the Middle East. And so all the psychoses of the Middle East have ended up coming to us. So, for example, the Arab oil-producing countries have had a tremendous benefit in terms of having a resource that they could have used to actually leapfrog in terms of development, but they didn't. I mean, and that is something that we have to take responsibility. So my fear right now is that the rest of the world is getting divided between those who are buying into the poor me argument of the Muslim world, which basically means you reinforce our own victimhood. But then there are those who say, we need to victimize these guys because they're bad guys anyway. And neither of those two paths is actually the way forward for us. The actual way forward for us is a more rational way of approaching things. Does Turkey benefit from belonging to the European Union? If it does, then every time you join a club, you have to fulfill certain conditions. And so the Turks know those conditions, and what can they do to actually expedite that? And again, it brings me back to that whole image of everybody being sort of playing a very complicated high-wire balancing act. How do you do that? You have your own people who are culturally fearful that, here are these people, they are bringing new and different cultures amongst us.
I'm going to stop for a second only because our time is tight, and I want to bring Ambassador Mapuri into the conversation on which is, we heard from Ambassador Haqqani the unique challenges of dealing with a country with very low GDP, with significant ethnic and religious challenges. Singapore has the third highest GDP in the world. You have a very diverse country, but a very small country. And I'm wondering if the challenges of the domestic politics, of trade, of globalization are different, or whether Singapore could offer a model that might be useful elsewhere.
Well, first on Islam, because I would take the Southeast Asian Muslim countries separate from the Middle East countries. I've served as ambassador both in Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesia has got the world's largest Muslim population. Many people don't realize that 90% of the population are Muslim. But it's layered on layers of different cultures and civilizations. You would see Hindu artifacts dating back, Buddhist artifacts dating back. You would see Catholics, Protestants, well integrated. And what do Indonesians and Malaysians want? They want the same things that globalization offers. Indonesia is probably the most connected country per capita next to the United States. Facebook, all Indonesians are on Facebook. They have leapfrogged into technology. Sure, you would have parts of Indonesia that are basically in the Stone Age. If you go out to the highlands of Papua, they are really in the Stone Age. But places like Jakarta, Bandung, Surabaya, these are countries that the model they have is a US globalization model. And if you shut that model off for them, then they will say, where do we go? This was what we were told since, and they all had communist rebellions, that we came along a certain path. And now suddenly that is shut off to us. And Singapore is very much part of that grouping as well. We're, of course, very small. We're 5 million people, multi-ethnic, still majority Chinese. We're 15% Muslim population. Indians are a mix of it. We had to focus on the fact that there is no option but trade and globalization. You couldn't put up walls around Singapore. What can you do? You can't eat. You don't have any power if you just shut everything off. Unlike countries like the United States, where you can say, I can shut everything off, and you'll get your energy and you'll get your food. We had to go global, which meant that the leadership had to go and convince the population that there is no alternative to this. We will help you adjust. Education is a key, and even today, there are new education things to get older workers back into schools. This whole idea that education is front-loaded in the first 20 years of your life, and then you expect to work, as you said, for the next 40 years with that same education, no longer applies. But we engage employers, we engage unions into this prospect. It is not a model of conflict, but rather one where consensus is built. Their adjustments are difficult. About a third of our working population come from overseas. There's tensions because people feel wages are being depressed because of them. But it's constant reminding people that there is really no option, that the world is your oyster. The choice of making English the first language, that was a choice to say we want to be in this modern world, not something that says some other Asian language which we all have, but it's really English. And that's where the key is. I'm not sure if it can be a model for other countries because it is really too unique and too small, but it's something where people can see and say, where can we learn bits and pieces from there?
So we're standing between our audience and wine, but I want to give Ambassador Vicini one word and then a final question.
To point out something that because there has been a lot of talk of trade here and the benefits of trade and resistance towards trade agreements, etc. But there is a large part of the world that is actually with or without wars, with or without trade agreements, that stands completely outside the world trade. 90 countries belong to the least developed countries in the world. Mm-hmm. Do you know how big part of the world trade or world export they stand for? 1.1%. And the small increase we have seen there comes from some oil exporting countries mostly in Africa, like Nigeria and Angola, for example. 1.1% of world exports come from these 90 countries. So, I mean, there is a huge potential to tap there, but it's a very, very complicated issue as well. And they really need all kinds of assistance to be able to develop their own trade to the benefit of their own populations.
Thank you for that. It's an important reminder. We're almost out of time. One of the benefits, though, of being a foreign diplomat in a country is that you see the country through a different lens than its own people sometimes do. And one of the jobs that you all have as ambassadors is to write a cable back home that tries to explain what's going on in this country. And so the question I have for you, and I'm asking you to literally 30 seconds each, when you write back to whether it's Singapore or Brussels, how do you describe what's happening in the United States today and help your governments back home see us through a different light?
Whatever the election outcome, I travel around the country a lot, and I see entrepreneurship, I see innovation, and that's what I think that I tell my people in Singapore. No matter what you watch in the news, there is very, very deep reservoirs of the economic growth that are coming out there. And it's something that Singapore wants to copy.
I see very much a copy of the debate that's going on in Europe. We have seen the same tendencies in Europe that you see here in these elections. There are huge swaths of the population that have been left behind. Nobody has explained to them how they are going to partake in the development. Some people have had jobs that do not exist anymore, and they don't even understand when you say app developer, what that is, nor how they could become an app developer. I think we see developments on both sides of the Atlantic that are very similar, and we need to find a way to not only describe the problem, but to solve the problem.
So I'm very well known in Pakistan for having criticized conspiracy theories within Pakistan. So I will send a very short cable. Don't worry too much. They are becoming exactly like us. You know, I mean, when 61% of a certain candidate's supporters actually believe that Barack Obama is Muslim, then obviously one has to suspend rationality for writing that cable.
Ambassador Uge, do you want to touch that?
I don't know. I think I'll...
Retired, so I'm not ambassador right now.
Yes, there is a benefit to retirement.
That helps. That helps.
I'll simply second what Caroline said, and I would say at the end of the cable we'll read the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. system of government is a time-tested system characterized by checks and balances, so in the end all will be well.
Jeff, do you want to be the dean of the Wharton School or an Australian and answer the question?
Well, what you probably don't know is that my first job out of college, I was supposed to join the Australian Foreign Service.
Oh, then you're on the hook.
Yeah, but I came to the US to do a PhD instead, and it certainly worked out well for me. I don't know whether the country is better off. Cable back home says, despite what you've heard, the coffee, the food, the beer is actually not as bad as it used to be in the US. Australians are snobs on all those dimensions, but more seriously, I mean, I'd underscore the checks and balances point is a profoundly important one, as is the fact that innovation and entrepreneurship is still the engine of the American economy. And that's remarkable because after the financial crisis, all around the world, certainly in my native Australia, people were writing the US off. It was last century's power, it's never coming back. 1-2 punch of Iraq war and the financial crisis, it's never coming back. That's not true. The US has come back, but of course politics is a messy business in this country.
So I want to ask you to join me in thanking our distinguished panel and We promised you a brief taste of substance tonight before the taste of food. But tonight is really about a cultural and culinary and academic celebration of all that Penn does in the global space, and particularly all that all of you have done to make Penn the extraordinary global force and intellectual home that it is. So on that note, I want to invite you to join us in that celebration with one instruction. I'm going to ask you to explore Perry Worldhouse, to visit the student lounge behind you where there's a bar and food set up, to visit the upstairs where there's another bar, while our team flips the room you're in into a reception space, and Vince and I will reconvene you once you all have a drink in your hand to raise a glass to the new Perry Worldhouse. Thank you all very much.